I'm going to do a demonstration on doing washes. Now for this, I pulled out my paint brushes, all my spare paint brushes, etc., etc. Now, what I've got here is I've got two soft bristle brushes for doing washes, and I've got one slightly stiffer brush. I'm also going to show how to do a dry brush technique. Now, I've got a couple of disposable cups here. What I'm going to do with these is I'm going to fill them up to a certain level with water, and since we're just doing gray and black, all I'm going to need is my black and white acrylic paint. We're going to do this on the Eagle, and then we're going to lightly sand an area on the Aries and redo a wash or go over a wash on the Aries. So let me get everything set up and we'll come right back. Okay, I've got my lunar regolith mixed up here on the left. I've got a medium to dark gray lunar regolith, and then I've got my black. As you know from looking at the moon texture, there's black, gray, shades of gray, white, etc. All tones, all grayscale tones. So what we're going to do is I'm going to set the camera aside for just a minute. Then I'm going to set up my first couple of parts. I'm going to go over the first couple of parts with a light gray wash, this wash on the left. Then I'm going to go over it with a black in certain areas to pull out the depth and detail of the parts. So let me get that set up and we'll be right back. Alright, so we're ready to do our first wash. Now I've got it sitting right there in the disposable paper plate so that I don't worry about making a mess or having something I've got to clean up later. I just toss the paper plate. So take a little lunar regolith and paint it over the top, the surface. Okay? Now you see how it's already pulling out detail. Now when it dries, it'll show even more detail in some areas, depending on how many layers you put on it. Okay, let's get a close-in look at that. Now, as you can see, that's going to pull out a lot more detail, and it's going to look like the regolith has been blown around all over the place by the thrusters and has landed here and there, showing the detail of some of the parts, the screens and the greeblies, etc. You can see from the left compared to the right, you don't quite have as much detail on the right, but there is some detail because I shot each one of these pieces with gray primer, then a light dusting of white. I didn't try to go totally flat white on the whole thing because I did want to kind of get that texture. Okay, now you can see the difference between the front two and the back two. The back two have barely been touched with any paint at all, as you can see here. And this has been weathered a bit by putting the gray regolith wash on and then dabbing it with a sponge to get rid of the excess and give kind of a natural splotchy feel, because that's what it's going to look like. Okay, when this stuff is kicked up and blowing around all over the place, it's going to land randomly. So you don't want to get too much of an articulate pattern, a clean, crisp, clear pattern on something to make it look like a natural wash or a natural weathering. Okay, now this seems to give a lot more natural look as far as I'm concerned, at least to my eye, than somebody with an airbrush, say, trying to airbrush some pseudo razzle-dazzle pattern on here to confuse the eye, because this looks natural. It looks like everything's been billowing and blowing around and just landed randomly in a scattered way, which is exactly what it would look like getting blown around all over on the surface of the moon. And then after this, you can go over, after everything's dry, hit it with acrylic sealer, and then go over it in certain areas with 400 or 600 grit sandpaper and a downward stroke to kind of get a little more downward flow going for the eye to see the regolith falling down the sides and the angles. Alrighty then, I've pretty much done all I'm going to do on these washes. Now, you've got each one of these landing pads or pods is different than the other. I didn't want all four of them to be exactly the same because that's just not how things work. When you're going down a dirt road out in the middle of the country, your right fender is not going to look like your left fender, your left rear fender is not going to look like your right rear fender, and your hood's not going to look like your roof or the back of your car because things move around randomly in chaotic patterns. So that's what I want. I want a random chaotic detail to these different parts. Now, since these are just acrylic paints, they're very easy to clean up. Now, I also did a little bit on the main pod assembly, and I was going to ask you, what do you do now to keep your colors good? Okay, because you want to maintain the same two washes so that you'll need them in the future. Well, that's real easy. You rinse your brushes out in fresh water and you put these bad boys in the freezer. Turn them into ice cubes. Then whenever you need them, to match perfectly to what you've already got for, say, another part, pull them out, let them thaw while you're doing something else, then come back and wash your new part to match your old parts, or to at least closely resemble your old parts. So there you go. You don't have to throw the stuff away. You stick it in the freezer and tell the wife, hands off. All right, so that's light washes. Now look at the difference in detail. Now this looks like an operating piece of machinery. It doesn't look like some flat white, bland, featureless chunk of nothing. And as I said, I'm going to go over these parts with a little bit of sandpaper later and clean up a couple places where I don't want stuff, or to soften things up. Now the next thing we're going to look at is how to do a dry brush and why to do a dry brush, and how to mask and why to mask. Keep on trekking, come back for more.